Welcome to Creation in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Carl Ball, founder and director of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. Now, the title to today's program has to do with your life and the function of your life. For instance, probably every person in this audience, a few nights, maybe most of the nights of the month, watch the moon. We are affected by the moon. The anorthite surface material of the moon is the reflective material, and now we're learning from every discipline of science, from the veterinary sciences to the astronomical sciences, that the moon literally does, in its reflectivity, affect living systems on planet Earth. The police departments in legal jurisprudence have verified that fact. Well, how old is the moon? We're going to learn from our special guest how old evolutionary theory postulates the moon is, and yet the biblical record states that during the first week of creation, the fourth day of creation, that Jesus verified had to do with the appearance of man before the week was out, and the biblical chronology states was only a few thousand years ago. If that be the case, this moon is very young. If, according to evolutionary theory, the moon was formed at approximately the time the Earth was formed, according to that concept, the moon would be about 4.5 billion years old. But knowing what evidence our guest is going to produce today, let's title this program, Our Young Moon. God made two great lights. One to rule the day, that's the sun. One to rule the night, that's the moon. And that ruling of the night is affected by the firmamental expanse, but the moon has a graphic history and a graphic present for you to grasp and understand in this program. I've invited on the program today a very fine friend of mine who has been interested in astronomy since his college and university days. His name is Spiros Psaris. Now, he is a computer specialist, having worked for a number of years in the United States military space program as an engineer, and I'd like to welcome, affectionately called Spike Psaris. So happy to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, your past has been most interesting. You've been interested in astronomy and preoccupied with astronomy and physics since your college days, right?
Correct, yes.
And I believe you entered the military space program as an atheist.
And an evolutionist.
And an evolutionist.
Absolutely.
But you are not an atheist. You're not an evolutionist.
Not anymore, no.
What changed all that?
I was working as an engineer, as you mentioned, and I wound up working side by side with a man who was a creationist and a Christian. And when he learned I was an evolutionist, we began talking about the question of origins, and he challenged me on my evolutionary beliefs, and he challenged me to reconcile those beliefs to the laws of physics that we worked with there every day. And it wasn't until that point that I realized that the laws of physics did not match my atheistic beliefs. They were very much at odds with each other. Wow. So that began a process of several months of searching and researching, trying to find the answer to this crisis that I had thrust upon me.
And it was a crisis.
It was indeed a crisis. I realized I'd been living my life based on a worldview that was a lie. And I didn't believe that at first. At first I thought there was just something I hadn't figured out yet to answer his questions. But the more we talked and the more I researched, the more I realized that the creation viewpoint is consistent, logical, matches the available evidence, and matches the laws of science, whereas my atheistic beliefs based on evolution was none of those things.
That's a beautiful statement. So Spike, Spiros, what did you do about it?
I became a creationist first, and then after a period of a little more struggle after that, became a Christian.
That is wonderful.
Realized that if there was a creation, there had to be a creator.
Yes.
And that the creator described in the Bible loved me enough to pay for my sin, to reconcile me to him. So how could I refuse such an offer?
How could you refuse such an offer? Astronomical dimensions and eternal dimensions involved. Oh, beautiful statement. So you found that according to the physics and the laws of physics, you were examining and running calculations about and researching in cosmological history that the time factor and the physics involved that you had assumed to be true, that were taught to be true, were not true at all.
Correct.
Now, most people are not that familiar with cosmological history and the claims. They just say, well, astronomers and astrophysicists believe the universe is billions of years old, perhaps 12, perhaps 16, perhaps 20 billion years old, and they support that in a foreground theory of evolution called biological evolution that is fostered upon the educational community in the naturalistic theory of evolution as Darwinian evolution, or neo-Darwinian evolution. And it's illustrated in this Tower of Time. This is the professional evolutionary naturalistic illustration. And it assumes, again, we need to check the assumptions as you did.
Yes.
It assumes that early primitive living systems evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. The Earth evolved about 4.6 billion years ago. That is assumed. Early living systems, bacteria, evolving about 3.5 billion years ago, progressing evolutionarily through all of these wonderful systems, dividing into the plants, and then producing about 228 million years ago, up till about 64 million years ago, these marvelous creatures we call the dinosaurs, introducing the mammals and ultimately producing man. Now, there is no basis for this. I've done programs with specialists before showing that the gaps between these living systems that Darwin said, if they were not filled, if it could not be demonstrated, that by slow progressive evolutionary changes, living systems modified and gained greater complexity, if that could not be demonstrated, then his theory would ultimately be destroyed.
Yes.
To use his term, utterly destroyed. And it would. There has never been field experience and excavations demonstrating the links between these. The gaps are enormous. The missing links are still missing. And in the laboratory analysis, tens of millions of tests have been run, like with the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster. We're not able to produce a higher order living system. Any mutational change actually destroys the information and compromises the information. So in the foreground, we have biological evolution that has not been demonstrated, in fact is discredited when we read the science closely. But now let's come to your area of special interest in astronomy. We have in the background the chart of the constellary heavens, the beautiful Messier galaxy, Messier 51 galaxy photographed by NASA. That's one of my favorite objects in space. So we have the background array of about 225 billion galaxies. But in the foreground, you've done a program with me on our solar system, and you've demonstrated that to be young, very young, consistent with biblical and creation model. Now, Spike, today, you're going to major on the moon, and you call it our young moon.
Yes.
Tell us about it, please.
Well, the moon is obviously the closest object in astronomy to us here on Earth, other than the Earth itself. And as such, it's one of the objects we've studied the most out of all of them. So therefore, you would think that if the evolution model were true, that we would find a lot of evidence there for the moon, because we have a lot of data from it. It's the only object other than the Earth that people have actually walked on.
Yes.
But when we really look at all the various lines of evidence that we've studied on the moon, they don't support the evolutionary model. They support the biblical model of creation instead.
Now, that's a bold statement.
It's
You're going
very
to have
bold.
to prove that to this global audience.